Hi, this is Kara, and welcome to Breaking Free Fridays, or welcome back if you've been following the series. It's great to have you here. Today, I was inspired to bring up the topic of are you being hijacked by trauma? And I wanted to really focus this video on awareness around what that may look like and feel like. At least in my experience and my journey, I didn't even realize that I had been traumatized. I've been dealing with trauma until I was well into my adulthood. And I think there's more awareness now, but it's one of those cases where awareness is the baseline, right? I mean, we can't really change anything or realize that next level of breakthrough or empowerment if we don't start from a place of awareness. And there are certain things that are somewhat unexpected and not necessarily automatically thought of when you think of trauma, or what it is to be hijacked by trauma. And we did talk about this a little bit in the cost of unresolved trauma, some of the indicators, and also really like the cost of that. And there's another video I would encourage you to watch as well around the top tools to free yourself from trauma. But in this one, I wanted to start with some context. I mean, most of us are aware of some of the higher level categories of trauma response and what it is to be hijacked at a higher level, and that includes things like the fight, more aggressive response to a threat, or the flight, which is more of the running away or intense panic. This can also come in the form of like the distractions, the addictions, things like that. And then you also have freeze, which quite literally can mean freeze, disassociation, things of that nature. And then there's another one that's a little less well known, which is that fawning response. And this one is really interesting because it's when someone adapts to a excessive people-pleasing type of approach in relationships. It's really around co-dependency and not having boundaries. And so that's one that's a little bit more unexpected and kind of interesting. But so there are a couple of areas where society and even families often actually reinforce and praise certain attributes and types of behaviors, or in some cases people might consider them personality attributes that are actually indicators of being hijacked by trauma. And one of those is perfectionism. There's a light side to perfectionism that shows up in the form of a striving for excellence and wanting to do really good work or whatever somebody is doing. But for the most part, perfectionism is a very extreme form of something that can't even be. It's not even possible. It doesn't actually exist, and so it's kind of a process of crazy making, unfortunately. And I am speaking to that from experience. I consider myself a recovering perfectionist, and there was a lot of my life where I considered that actually to be a strength and something that I valued. And yet it cost a lot. It cost a lot in health and in just joy. It cost a lot in terms of joy. I mean, it cost or not being able to have that joy because of the crazy making that becomes perfectionism. Workaholism is another one that has traditionally been revered. And yes, the like working hard part of it is something that is great. But when it becomes something that is so compulsory and so extreme, that's where it gets into those unhealthy things, and it can be an indication of being hijacked from trauma, because it's a form of avoidance, extreme avoidance, by focusing in on a very specific area where a person can feel a sense of satisfaction or progress or worth, if you will. The perfectionism is another one. It's like instead of getting that sense of self-worth and love and validation and acceptance from within, it's a way of trying to seek that externally. And that's a really tricky place to be, because it actually creates disempowerment, because you're giving your power away to others for that validation. But it can be an indication of that trauma root. And another thing is control issue, like extreme control issues, where if you find yourself having a very difficult time allowing others to help, where you believe you have to do everything or it's not going to get done right. I mean, that kind of weaves into perfectionism a little bit too. But that's another area. And some of these things are just great opportunities to just reflect, and look at, okay, am I experiencing these things at all? That people pleasing in an extreme fashion, or that codependency side of things, where we end up basically compromising and self-sacrificing to a degree that is almost harmful to ourselves, with the idea that we're being selfless, but it's an unhealthy dynamic, and it comes out of that trauma response. So that's another piece. And one thing that I wanted to shed light on, because I found this really interesting, and when you have that people pleasing, that codependency aspect in play, there's usually a rescuing kind of behavior, and it can also be very compulsory in nature when you're talking about an indication of that trauma hijack, and it's one of those things that it really creates a dynamic where, for that to be in play, there's someone that's taking on the rescuer role. And for a rescuer to exist, there has to be a victim. And for the victim to exist, there has to be a perpetrator. And it's like this cycle that perpetuates and creates this unhealthy pattern. And usually there's abuse involved, which is something that feeds that trauma. So I thought it was really interesting when I heard that from a very beloved mentor of mine, and it just really shed light on, wow, there is some great opportunity to break free from those dynamics. And when you see them at play, and how they interact with one another, we want to find our way to a place of empowerment individually across all of our relationships, where we've moved beyond the lessons of those archetypes, if you will. So that was another piece that I thought was really interesting. Another element of hijack from trauma that can show up is if there is an immense emotional deregulation, and that can show up in extreme forms of emotion. It can also show up in somebody reacting very out of character, a level of defiance, for example, that is really intense, a level of disengagement that's really intense, someone being very unreasonable, that's very out of character for them. Typically speaking, those can indicate being hijacked by trauma, and it means the system is so overwhelmed that there's not an ability in that moment to actually rely on our executive functioning and our conscious thought. And so in those times, if we are able to actually realize that of our own self, if that's happening, using some of the tools, giving ourselves space, making sure that we don't try to resolve something with another person in that moment, but we give ourselves time to really regulate again and come back to center. And if a loved one is in that place, it's important to recognize, to not take that personally, and to realize that that person is being hijacked in that moment, and they need space. They need to come back to a place of regulation. So that's something that I wanted to make sure to share too, because sometimes it's really easy to take things personally, and that is another attribute actually of being hijacked by trauma, is to take things so personally, or being very defensive to an extreme, because it lends to this pattern of over responsibility and that fixing, that trying to solve the problem, that rescuing kind of behavior. So any area where there's that compulsory kind of tendency, that's an opportunity to look at an area where there's some room for breaking free and becoming more empowered. So I invite you to take some time to kind of reflect on that. No judgment. It's just to be curious and to become aware, because it's so fundamental to see and be aware for us to be able to make movement in a different direction. So I invite you to take some time to do that, and to watch the video about top tools to free yourself from trauma, to get some ideas and some ways that you can start incorporating some opportunities to break free from those trauma hijacks. And if you're enjoying these videos, I encourage you to subscribe. Send a like, and any comments I would love to hear, and anything that you'd like to explore more, I would love to hear that as well. And what you've been experiencing, what you've noticed on those trauma hijacks, because every person's journey and experience is so unique and so different. So I would love for the community to start relaying some of those experiences too. And I hope you have a great week. Here's to another level of empowerment and to breaking free. And I'll see you next week. Thanks.